I simply didn't think of myself as an atheist. I didn't use the word, in the same way that I don't think of myself as a non-astrologer. No one has to wake up in the morning and repudiate astrology by accepting the identity as a non-astrologer. And there's no one virtually no one believes in Zeus, and we haven't defined ourselves in opposition to paganism. We're not non-pagans. And I think it's also useful to point out that every devout Christian stands in the same relationship to Hinduism or to Islam as I do. The Christians look at what's going on in Muslim discourse. They look at the claim that the Quran is the perfect word of the Creator of the universe, and they are not persuaded. And that's all my atheism consists of. I'm not persuaded by these patently ridiculous claims, and I am persuaded by the evidence that these people are part of a culture that is designed to not look critically at its own discourse. And so Christians can see that of Islam. They can point out the errors of thinking there. They just don't point it out in Christianity. From my point of view, I don't think, this is where I may differ from some of my colleagues, I don't think the word atheism ultimately is necessary or even useful, and I think it's actually, in the end, harmful, because the rejection of absurdity is much bigger than atheism. It is science. Reason is much bigger than atheism. And having standards of evidence and argument is much bigger than atheism. And that's all we need to repudiate most of what most people do most of the time in the name of religion.
You can't answer the question of what's a good life scientifically. You can't.
Why not?
I can say what will make you feel a certain way. But whether that's good, let me give you an example. You talked about happiness. There are some people who've lived very unhappy lives that religiously you would evaluate as very good lives. Rabbi Akiva at the end of his life was not happy. Right? He was martyred. But if you were to bring Rabbi Akiva back to life and say, would you say that the end of your life was good or bad? He would say, I have no doubt, painful but good. And if you said to him, but what about scientifically? He would say, well, scientifically I was being burned alive. But you can't evaluate my life scientifically. And in fact, I just want to give one little sermonic coda here. Anybody, just one. Yeah. Just one for the moment. Okay. How could you know me so quickly? Anybody who has children or who believes that they're doing something important in this world, or who works in difficult circumstances to bring water to villages or food to hungry people, would say that the idea that you could scientifically demonstrate a good life is worse than empty. It's a mockery.
Okay, well that's good. I see that the term happiness is a little too effete to capture what I'm after here. I'm talking about well-being. I'm talking about all of the factors that we recognize that correspond to the good life. And I'm certainly open to the possibility that we have yet to fully characterize the good life religiously, philosophically, and certainly scientifically. This is an open conversation. The question is, do you ever have to believe anything on insufficient evidence to explore this terrain, to become truly...
and what is sufficient evidence?
Well, it's the kind of evidence everyone in this room demands on any subject other than religion. There are nuances here. It takes a lot of work to rise to the standard of scientific evidence, but science is the one language game we are playing where we get really straight and rigorous about what constitutes evidence, where there's a process of peer review, where you have a lot of smart people trying to prove you wrong, and where you actually win points by proving yourself wrong. This is not what religions are up to. Religions are not falsifiable in this way. And I think you used a phrase that I thought was very useful to frame this. You talked about what used to be and what must be, I think was your phrase. And I think we should reflect on what used to be, because our religions come to us out of a tradition in many cases, of human sacrifice. I mean, a human sacrifice was virtually a cultural universal. This is where we come from. These are the roots of religion. It has been it's been by no means rare for a child to be born into this world only to find that he is being raised by religious maniacs who think that the best way to keep the sun on its course or to cure the king's venereal disease is to bury or butcher or burn him alive as an offering to an imaginary god. This is not just the Aztecs. This is the ancient Hebrews. Human sacrifice is in the Hebrew Bible, at times condemned, at times tacitly supported, at times demanded, and then, as you know in the story of Abraham, the demand is recanted. We come from generations of people who did not know a damn thing about the causes of events in the world that really concern them: the spread of disease, the failure of crops, the weather. And so religious discourse has changed. We're not sacrificing people happily now, but it has changed by virtue of progress from the outside. I mean, just certain modes of operation are no longer tenable. When you can get a weather report on the evening news, you no longer have to sacrifice a child in a vain attempt to control the weather.
Okay, so I'm a materialist, a monist. I'm not a dualist. I think humans are by nature dualists, that we think that there's an extra substance, a soul, a spirit, an agent, a hidden force, some kind of energy, a god, a gods, whatever. But that's a product of our brains misperceiving the world and infusing into it these hidden, invisible agents that we think are there that aren't really there. And you know I'm right because... because I'm a published skeptic anyway. So if you get a brain injury, if you get a stroke, particularly dramatically Alzheimer's or senility or dementia, as the neurons die one by one, so does your mind. There is no mind. The mind is just one of these fuzzy words that gets thrown about, that if we try to operationally define it carefully, we find we're just describing what the brain does. So mind is just a word to describe what the brain does. The soul is just a word, a fuzzy word, to describe our pattern of information, our memories, and our essence and our being, which dies when we die, and so forth. It's no more mysterious, by the way, where you go after you die than where you were before you were born. Why does nobody get all fussed up about, well, where was I before I was born?
But it remains a fact that yogis and mystics are said to be walking on water and raising the dead and flying without the aid of technology, materializing objects, reading minds, foretelling the future, right now. In fact, all of these powers have been ascribed to Satya Sai Baba, the South Indian guru, by an uncountable number of eyewitnesses. He even claims to have been born of a virgin, which is not all that uncommon a claim in the history of religion, or in history generally. Genghis Khan supposedly was born of a virgin, as was Alexander. Apparently, parthenogenesis doesn't guarantee that you're going to turn the other cheek. But Satya Sai Baba is not a fringe figure. He's not the David Koresh of Hinduism. His followers threw a birthday party for him recently, and 1 million people showed up. So there are vast numbers of people who believe he is a living God. You can even watch his miracles on YouTube. Prepare to be underwhelmed. I mean, it's true that he has an afro of sufficient diameter as to suggest a total detachment from the opinions of his fellow human beings, but I'm not sure this is reason enough to worship him. In any case, so consider, as though for the first time, the foundational claim of Christianity. The claim is this: that miracle stories of a sort that today surround a person like Satya Sai Baba become especially compelling when you set them in the pre-scientific religious context of the first century Roman Empire, decades after their supposed occurrence. We have Satya Sai Baba's miracle stories attested to by thousands upon thousands of living eyewitnesses, and they don't even merit an hour on the Discovery Channel. But you place a few miracle stories in some ancient books, and half the people on this earth think it a legitimate project to organize their lives around them. Does anyone else see a problem with that?
So there's one postscript to my story, which was mentioned in the introduction. And this is not really exactly about religion, but it is kind of about my story of religion. And that is that 7 years after I left my religion, I experienced a great tragedy. My child, who was almost 4 months old, Carl, died on his first day in childcare. Now, I raise this because many people who know my religious background have asked me whether this kind of terrible, unbearable loss made me want to go back to religion. And I think it's an interesting question. So just to set the framework for where I was when I gave birth to my son, I had already, after 7 years, overcome a lot of obstacles by the time he came along. It hadn't been easy to start a new life outside my religion. But the one thing that I had not prepared myself for post-religion was a tragedy like this. I hadn't thought about what it would be like to experience loss without faith. I don't think anyone can really be prepared for the loss of a child, but it blindsided me. I think that I thought on some level that there was some quota of difficulties that you would go through in your life, and that after so much loss already that I had experienced and so much pain, that now everything, somehow the universe would stretch out before me and be good and kind and just and nothing bad would happen. But of course it's not that orderly. When my son died, I was faced with an entirely foreign landscape. Death without hope of an afterlife. Grief without the comfort of religion. I say this because I knew grief with religion. My father had died when I was 18, when I was a Jehovah's Witness. And I was sad, but I wasn't that sad because I was certain that one day I would see him again in paradise. Religion was born for things like this, for death, for tragedy. It's the ultimate escape from it. My faith, I realize now, looking back, had acted as a buffer to many of these very difficult things of being human, the more devastating emotions of what we had to experience in life. And now, when I lost my son, without that faith, I just experienced his death as nothingness. A child so full of promise, health, and energy, and future just vanished. It was beyond my ability to understand or to accept. And it was the ultimate test for someone who had once had belief. So when people asked if I was tempted to go back to my religion, I could honestly say that if belief were a choice, there are definitely times where I would have chosen it. Because as I said, it was comforting to just turn off the emotions I didn't want to feel, to just believe that there was something else that would resolve them for me. But the truth is that there was now no believing what I now knew to be a myth at best, a lie at worst. And trying to believe something that you know to be false is not comforting. But let me tell you what I discovered about grief without religion. It has some surprising byproducts. I now had no choice but to live with the reality of loss, to deal with what was in front of me. At first, what was in front of me was just utter darkness on every level. But once you have been that close to death, especially that kind of death, the death of a child, something else happens when you can't escape it by thinking about paradise or heaven or somewhere else. And that is that you become deeply attuned and deeply grateful to life. In the midst of this kind of grief that is so all-encompassing, where you have no escape, you're forced to experience an even deeper pain, but you also become more clear-eyed about life. And I found that I started to see, to my utter surprise, that there were glimpses of beautiful things in this suffering. Some of those things were the memories I had of my son, which, when you look after a newborn baby for almost 4 months, as a mother, I've spent every minute with him, and the memories became just seared in my mind, and they were so meaningful and so beautiful. And the other thing that I encountered and focused on and noticed was the depth of care and compassion and empathy that came from the fellow human beings around me. People that were friends and people that I didn't know alike. You don't see this every day. I'm from New York, so I use the analogy of you're crowded in a subway and everyone's a jerk. You get cut off by annoying drivers where you drive cars. It's easy to forget that we all, as human beings, possess this deep humanity.
About 30 seconds.
Okay. But when I was in such great pain, so many people, both strangers and friends alike, got me through by showing me love in many ways. And it was the strangest thing to experience such an awful thing and yet be touched by beauty and love. Now time has gone by, and without the escape of belief, I've learned more. I've learned how to live with everyone's worst nightmare, and I'm still alive, which sometimes feels like a feat. And I've learned patience and endurance and how to tolerate devastating feelings, because that's what living without your child requires. Someone once told me that great grief is like a character test, and it does feel like that. It takes all my energy not to devolve into anger and jealousy and feelings of why me. But since I do not believe that my son is out there somewhere or will come back to me, it's meant that I've kept him alive in ways in the here and now. And one way I did that was becoming an activist for paid parental leave. And through this work, I found that death without hope didn't have to be death without faith. And how so? It's because activism can be an act of faith. A faith that when there are problems, that we as human beings can find ways to solve them. And a faith that others would join me in a fight for what was right, and they did. In my own old religion, we were taught not to put our faith in man. But if humankind is all we have, or at least all that's available to us at this time, perhaps this faith that we can change the world is not misplaced. That's what I've learned, and I'm not willing to give up hope yet. I think many of us have all of us have suffered loss, and we can relate to this. I don't have all the answers now, but I can say that I appreciate the deep mystery of it all, and I feel the magic of life all around me and this power of our shared humanity, and I feel deep gratitude. And it's been very lovely to be here with all of you today. Thank you.
Now, as someone who spent the last 2 years criticizing religious faith, I've become quite familiar with how people of faith rise to the defense of God. As it turns out, there are not 100 ways of doing this. There appear to be just 3. Either you argue that a specific religion is true, or you argue that religion is useful, or you attack atheism as intolerant, elitist, or otherwise corrosive of basic human values. Now, the only line of argument that is relevant to this debate, or indeed any debate about the validity of religion, is an argument that religion is true. Or rather, that one religion is true, because of course they can't all be true. In fact, our opponents here stand for 2 distinct and mutually incompatible faiths. Was Jesus Christ the Messiah? The rabbi and Dinesh are not likely to agree on that point. As Bertrand Russell pointed out over 100 years ago, even if we knew one of the Earth's religions was true, perfectly true, given the multiplicity of faiths, given their mutual incompatibility, all believers should expect damnation purely as a matter of probability. But before I go deeper into this issue of religion's truth, I just want to illustrate how confused a person must be to argue that it is reasonable to believe in God because religion is useful, because it gives life meaning, because it makes people more moral than they otherwise would be, as the rabbi suggested, because it makes people happy, any of the benefits you could imagine of religion. Okay, imagine you're walking down the street and you run into an old friend, and he looks radiantly happy. You ask him what's going on in his life, and he tells you that everything changed for him the day he realized that he was destined to marry Angelina Jolie. It might occur to you, ask, why does he believe this? I mean, Angelina Jolie is, after all, one of the most beautiful and famous people on the planet. She's not incidentally married to Brad Pitt. They have something like 27 children at this point. Okay, what if your friend, sensing your skepticism, said, you clearly don't understand. This belief gives my life meaning. Okay, I now know my purpose in life. It's to be Angelina's husband. What if your friend said that this belief has made me a better person? I'm now incredibly kind to children, anticipating having to raise Angelinas once Brad leaves. Or what if your friend said to you, you can believe whatever you want, but I wouldn't want to live in a universe where I don't marry Angelina Jolie. Okay, it should be quite clear at this point that your friend has lost his mind. Okay, and it's probably a dangerous person, and yet this is precisely the kind of talk that so often passes for wisdom in religious circles and may attempt to pass for wisdom here. Certainly the morality argument is of that sort. Beliefs are not like clothing. Okay? Comfort and utility and attractiveness cannot be our conscious criteria for adopting them. To believe a proposition, you have to believe that you have good reasons for believing it. And the effect that this belief will have on your life cannot be among those reasons. And this is what it is to be clouded by bias. This is why we have phrases like wishful thinking and self-deception. To really believe that there is a God is also to believe that you stand in some relation to his existence, such that if he didn't exist, you wouldn't believe in him. How does the supposed usefulness of religion fit into this scheme? It doesn't.
There are certain common elements that come through that are obviously culturally bound. So where you just happen to be born determines which religion you are a part of. So explaining it in a way refutes it in the sense different than it would be if it was, say, I'm explaining why people vote Republican or why people vote Democratic, something like that. Because we know those are made up categories. Religions are making different claims. They're making absolute claims to truth, and therefore the explanation that there's a cultural, behavioral genetics origin of it, then I think provides positive evidence that we made God and religions, not vice versa. For example, flood myths show similar cultural influence. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates by centuries the Noachian flood story, tells exactly the same story. And anthropologists tell us that cultures that are next to large bodies of water that flood tend to have flood myth stories. Virgin birth myths are likewise spring up throughout the ages. Among those alleged to have conceived without the usual assistance of a male include Dionysus, Perseus, Buddha, Attis, Krishna, Horus, Mercury, Romulus, and of course, Jesus. Consider the parallels between Dionysus, the ancient Greek god of wine, and Jesus of Nazareth. Both were said to have been born of a virgin mother, who was a mortal woman, but were fathered by the King of Heaven. Both allegedly returned from the dead, transformed water into wine, and introduced the idea of eating and drinking the flesh and blood of the Creator, and both were said to have been the liberator of mankind. For some reason, there's like that Joseph Campbell stuff about recurring myths that happen again and again, perhaps a product of our brains, of our culture, some combination. There are resurrection myths, same thing. There's lots and lots of resurrection stories that well predate the Christ story, like Osiris, the god of Egypt that was said to have died and come back, just like the sun goes down and comes back. And initially, only the pharaoh gets to be resurrected, but the Egyptians cleverly decided that if everybody can be resurrected by believing in the God King, including the pharaoh, you can get a lot of free labor to build monuments. So in that sense, then, I think let's take a look back at the origins of religion and God belief. So first of all, we're pattern-seeking primates. We look to connect the dots to explain things in the world. God is the ultimate pattern connection device. It explains everything. And we also tend to infuse these patterns with agency, intentional agents that are invisible and run the world, control things. They control the weather, angels and demons and aliens and poltergeists and gods. These are just things we infuse from about the age of several months old into objects that we think of them as intentional agents. We know from behavioral genetics studies that roughly 40 to 50% of the variance on people's religious beliefs are accounted for by genes. That is, your inheritance, your propensity to believe this versus that is explained by your genetics. Now, it's not that there's a gene for Catholicism or Baptist or something like that. It's that certain religions appeal to certain kinds of temperaments that are genetically programmed. So just like some people tend to prefer to vote liberal, others to vote conservative, in part, at least half, because of their personalities and temperament and the kind of political parties they prefer. Same thing with religion. Some religions tend to offer more that we like. So you know God is man-made and religions are man-made when they happen to like and hate the same people you like and hate.
But I think there's we the atheist community is somewhat culpable for this because we're criticizing faith and irrational belief in gods. What I've run into in talking about Islam specifically among atheists is a sense that we're somehow logically committed to being equally opposed to all religions, irrespective of their effects. So to sort of single out Islam from the point of view of atheism is somehow to be co-opted by by bigotry, by an alliance with Christians. But I mean, there's nothing that demands that we not notice the different consequences between different faiths. I mean, anyone who is just as worried about the Amish or about Anglicans as they are about Islam is just reading the wrong section of the newspaper.
I'll let you come out of the closet as clearly as possible. Would you call yourself an atheist or an agnostic?
Well, I don't like the term atheist because it usually means somebody who's going around upbraiding people and trying to force them to listen to his arguments for why there is no God. I don't think there's a God, so I'm an atheist, but I don't make a deal of it. I think it's not that I passionately believe there is no God. It's that, of course there isn't a God, but so what?
So the difference in your mind is not one of how confident you are that there's not a God. I mean, you're 100% sure there's not a God.
100%, am I 100% sure of anything?
Okay.
I'm as sure of it as I am of anything, yeah, I guess.
Okay. But not 100%. I mean, the reason I ask is because that version of atheism has always struck me as in some technical sense logically indefensible, right? I mean...
You can't prove a negative.
Right.
I think it was Bertrand Russell once said he couldn't prove that there was not a teapot orbiting Mars.
Right.
So he's a teapot agnostic. I'm a teapot agnostic with regard to God, too, I suppose. I can't prove that God doesn't exist.
Right. And what are you...
For one thing, the reason I can't prove that is that apparently no two people mean the same thing by God.
Right.
And some people, what they mean by God is nature. Well, that exists, and they worship nature.
Right.
So do I, in a way. Does that mean I believe nature is God? Well, who knows?
Yeah.
It's not supernatural.
Okay.
It's wonderful as all get out, but it isn't supernatural.
Okay. And do you feel you're missing anything? I mean, do you wish you could believe in God? Is there no void in your life?
No. In fact, I think that's actually a much more interesting question to ask most people. Or actually, it's hard to ask them because they don't want to answer it. I have a feeling that not that many people actually believe in God. Many people believe in belief in God. That is, they think it's a good thing. And they try to believe in God. They hope they could believe in God. They wish they could believe in God. And they say they believe in God. They go through all the motions. They try very hard to be devout. And sometimes they succeed. And for periods of their lives, they actually do, in some sense, believe that there's a God. And they think they're the better for it. Otherwise, they behave like people who probably don't believe in God. Very few people behave as if they really believe in God. A lot of people behave as if they believe they should believe in God.
Well, how would you behave if you believed in God?
You would perhaps, and some people do this, be prepared to take what other people would call suicidal risks because you believe God is going to be there to save you. You would be prepared to give away everything that you own because God commanded you to do it, and so forth.
Well, yeah, although there you're actually talking about a specific conception of God.
Yeah,
It's not
right,
any conception
right.
of God that would make you think you could take risks without fear of death.
No.
And I guess that's...
Well, that's one of the problems with belief in God, is that it is so amorphous and undefined. It's not like believing in helium or believing...
What I'm saying is there can be different definitions.
Oh,
it may
sure.
also be amorphous, but I'm just referring to the problem of there being...
Sure, many different definitions.
Right. So. But along those lines, are you're rejecting also the idea of kind of higher purpose of any kind?
Higher than our purposes, yes.
Yes. Do you manage to be a good person?
I think I'm.
In your objective judgment.
Well,
I mean,
like all the children in Lake Wobegon, I think I'm above average in morality.
Oh, congratulations! Above average for a bright or for
no
you're about an average.
I don't. There's the things I've done that are wrong. I've got my little bits of guilty conscience, but I don't think I've done anything very, very bad. And I think I've done a lot of good.
I guess the question is, you don't see belief in God, or even belief in any kind of higher power, or even a belief in a transcendent foundation for morality. You don't see any of that. That's really necessary as far as creating good behavior.
Let's talk about transcendent and morality. One of the things that we have evolved to discover on this planet is arithmetic. We didn't invent it. We didn't make it. We found it. Mm-hmm. It is eternal, a priori, true. It's just great stuff. And it's true everywhere in the universe. It's true everywhere in any universe. There's only one arithmetic. Now, is that transcendent? I would say, yeah, that's... I don't know for sure what you mean by transcendent.
It's kind of like a Platonic thing that was
it's sort of, it's this sort of Platonism.
And we happened upon its truth.
We've discovered it, and it's true. Now, could there be a sort of similarly Platonic ethics? Could we find the universal principles of good behavior for intelligent beings? I'm agnostic about that. I don't see why we couldn't. I don't see that the parochialism of our concerns would necessarily stand in the way of. I mean, we can ask the same question about ethics that we ask about arithmetic. If we went to another planet, if the search for intelligent life, extraterrestrial life that was intelligence, if this paid off, if we discovered another civilization somewhere in the galaxy that was intelligent, what would it share with us? Well, it would certainly share arithmetic. Maybe not base 10 arithmetic. That's anybody's guess. It might be base 12 or base 16 or base 8. Who knows? That's an accident. But it would still be arithmetic. Now, we can say, and would it share ethical principles with us? And I think, in some regards, yes, it would. Now, does that make those principles transcendent? Yeah. It's not might makes right, and it's not this is what our grandfathers did, so this is what we're going to do. It's not just historical accident. I think that there could be a truly universal basis for ethics.
You mean to get to a point where any species could produce these great kind of collective products, which technologies and things are, they would have to come up with rules of the road for collaborative, cooperative interaction. Sure. Okay, and is that...
It's like the evolution of cooperation.
Right, yeah. Very much. Yeah. And I mean, you could almost say that it's like I don't know, and I talked about this with Steve Pinker a little too, who discusses it in I think one of his books. I don't know if he used the phrase "strange attractor," but it's kind of like a truth that's out there.
It's an attractor,
that certain kinds of evolution are going to happen upon when they get in the vicinity. Now,
it's what I call a good trick with a capital G, capital T in Darwin's Dangerous Idea.
Right.
There are these good tricks of design which are going to be discovered again and again and again because they are the eternal good tricks. Arithmetic's one. Yeah. I think ethics is another.
Now, what if somebody noted this by way of suggesting that that adds to the evidence that evolution had some purpose. If it naturally happens upon something that even you would agree is moral truth, okay? Natural selection is likely to produce a species that happens upon moral truth. Doesn't that lend credence to the argument that maybe there was some point to the whole exercise?
I don't think so.
No? I was kind of thinking you might say that. I don't know.
No, it just happens. And we can explain why it happens.
Does death bother you? You said that one definition of a bright, this emerging interest group to which you proudly belong, is that they don't believe in life after death. Yeah. Would you rather there were life after death?
No, I'd rather live to be 1,000. but
then if you died at 1,000, what would be your preferences for an afterlife?
I think the concept of an afterlife is a very useful fantasy for handling the grief of small children and others, and I don't disparage it. I think it takes a very strong and brave person to take on the task of comforting a child whose parent has just died, for instance, and the consolation value of believing that mommy's up there watching you is boy, that's a lifeboat in the storm, if ever there was one. It is so transparently useful at times like that,
right,
that I dare say that is enough to explain its popularity as an idea for our species for all time.
I think we should think about what this concept of the afterlife does. Just to give some context, we're living in a world in which 9 million children every year die before they reach the age of 5. Okay, year after year after year. I mean, that is an Asian-style tsunami of the sort you remember from 2004 every 10 days, killing only children before the age of 5. I mean, think about these children. Think about their parents. Know that virtually all of these parents are people who believe in God and were praying all the while that their children would be saved. And their prayers were not answered. Now, the afterlife comes into the midst of this reality and as a promise that all of this is going to make sense in the end, that somehow at the end of existence we're going to be all let in on the punchline and have a mighty laugh with Almighty God for eternity. Now, there's no evidence of that, and I think, therefore, this concept of the afterlife really functions as a substitute for wisdom. It functions as a substitute for really absorbing our predicament, which is that everyone is going to die. There are circumstances that are just catastrophically unfair. Evil sometimes wins, and injustice sometimes wins. And the only justice we're going to find in the world is the justice we make. And I think we have an ethical responsibility to absorb this really down to the soles of our feet. And this notion of an afterlife, the happy talk about how it's all going to work out and it's all part of God's plan, is a way of shirking that responsibility.
What we did is we put 2 capuchin monkeys side by side, and if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the 2 monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. If you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task, and we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us, and that's what she does. And she gets a grape, and she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now, against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here. Let me tell you, I still have 2 minutes left. Let me tell you a funny story about this. This study became very famous, and we got a lot of comments, especially anthropologists, economists, philosophers. They didn't like this at all because they had decided in their mind, I believe, that fairness is a very complex issue and that animals cannot have it. And so one philosopher even wrote us that it was impossible that monkeys had a sense of fairness because fairness was invented during the French Revolution. So, now, and another one wrote a whole chapter saying that he would believe it had something to do with fairness if the one who got grapes would refuse the grapes. Now, the funny thing is that Sarah Brosnan, who's been doing this with chimpanzees, had a couple of combinations of chimpanzees where indeed the one who would get the grape would refuse the grape until the other guy also got a grape. So we're getting very close to the human sense of fairness, and I think philosophers need to rethink their philosophy for a while. So let me summarize. I believe there's an evolved morality. I think morality is much more than what I've been talking about, but it would be impossible without these ingredients that we find in other primates, which are empathy and consolation, pro-social tendencies, and reciprocity and a sense of fairness. And so we work on these particular issues to see if we can create a morality from the bottom up, so to speak, without necessarily God and religion involved, and to see how we can get to an evolved morality. And I thank you for your attention.
We define physics as, loosely speaking, our best effort to understand the behavior of matter and energy in the universe. So it's defined with respect to the goal of understanding how matter is going to behave. Now, anyone else is free to define physics in some other way. I mean, a creationist physicist could come into the room and say, well, that's not my definition of physics. I want my physics, I want to simply match the book of Genesis. And we are free to exclude that person and say, well, you really don't belong at this conference. That's not physics as we are interested in it. You're using the word differently. You're not playing our language game. That gesture of exclusion, in no sense, the fact that the discourse of physics is not sufficient to silence that guy, that person can't be brought into the conversation, doesn't nullify physics as a domain of right and wrong answers. And yet, on the subject of morality, we seem to think that the possibility of differing opinions, the fact that someone can come forward and say, well, no, my morality has nothing to do with human flourishing, it has to do with following, Sharia law. The fact that that position can be articulated, I hear people like Jonathan and certainly many philosophers saying, well, that proves in some sense that there's no there. This is all made up. This is not, we can't, the fact that you can articulate a different position is a problem for the whole field. And I think it's not. So I think we have, obviously we have an intuitive physics, and much of our intuitive physics is wrong with respect to the goal of understanding how matter and energy are going to behave in the universe. What I want to say is that most people, most of us, most cultures have an intuitive morality. And much of our intuitive morality may be wrong with respect to the goal of maximizing human flourishing.
I say all of this to say that I've learned that I have to check my own thinking to ensure that I'm not succumbing to my own cult-like tendencies that are part of me as a human being. And how do we do this? I have no idea. But I do have some ideas, just from my own experience. I think it's important to make friends with people who don't think like us. And that may sound trite, but in my story, if you remember, or I gave you a few details, but what made it possible for me to leave was that I did open myself up to a close relationship with someone that was the other. I didn't believe everything that he told me he believed, and I still don't, but the differences between us were what made it possible for me to see that not everything I had been taught to believe by my culture was absolute truth, even if it had seemed to add up. Allowing myself to get close to someone so different than me was what made me see that. And it wasn't always pleasant to see those things, but I'm really grateful that I didn't back away or dismiss him. Also, I think there's another thing to think about is that I find for myself it's really easy for me to get into Twitter arguments with people on the other side. But I think it's much easier to argue and be polarized on Twitter. But if you have a relationship with someone, you're much more inclined to challenge each other in meaningful ways. It goes both ways. So I think ultimately we need each other. We're social creatures, but we need our differences too. I've also learned this, that when we feel we're really sure that we're right, that's always a sign that, to me, that I need to look deeper and question my strongest assumptions, to not be dogmatic about anything. It doesn't mean that we're not right, but we have to be open to the possibility that what we hold dear is not 100% true or right all of the time. Life is complicated. And finally, never let your identity be too hijacked by a group or a belief. I think it's really important to step outside our comfort zone and put ourselves in positions that make us feel off kilter, because that's when we get opened up and that's when we learn new things. I say to this day that if I had not gone to China, I would most definitely still be a Jehovah's Witness. I bet that's probably the only person who's ever said that in the history of mankind. Okay.
Well, they don't think that their body doesn't disintegrate. They assume that it does disintegrate. What they assume is that there is something inside of you that is eternal, which I assume as well.
And
it doesn't seem to me
doesn't
seem to me anti-scientific.
Well, it's anti-scientific if you believe that you have good evidence for that. I mean, this is what's anti-scientific. When your certainty, when your convictions don't scale with your evidence. I mean, I'm actually open-minded on the survival of death. I don't know.
You say about reincarnation, that there could even be evidence for it in your book.
Yes, I mean, I can easily tell you what would constitute evidence. I'm not saying this evidence exists, but I mean, I can tell you what would constitute evidence for the truth of Mormonism. It's just not forthcoming. There are all kinds of scientific things you can say about religion, which religious people tend not to want to hear. I mean, you can say, for instance, that Mormonism is objectively less likely to be true than Christianity. Now, why can you say this? Because Mormonism is just Christianity plus some rather stupid ideas.
And do we have any questions?
We do. We have a question from Amy. Amy asks, do you think you can be both an atheist and an agnostic? A little of both. Can you think there is no God, but also say you can't know for certain? We talk about this all the time.
We do, yeah. It's kind of like asking, can you be an American and a Democrat? You know, I mean, like, they're two different things. You can be both. And it's because, as we talked about on an earlier show, atheism/theism are addressing the question of what do you believe. But agnosticism/Gnosticism are addressing the question of what do you know. And so they're totally different things. So you can be totally agnostic and say, I don't know, but also say, neither do I believe. So I think most agnostics, which I'm an agnostic, I think we're all agnostics when it comes to these things, most agnostics are atheistic agnostics, although there's a few agnostics who are theistic agnostics. You were talking about Pascal earlier. Mm-hmm. Pascal was this Roman Catholic believer who basically admitted he was an agnostic. We don't know if there's a God. I don't know, and we can't know, but you're better off believing. So you would call Pascal a theistic agnostic, and you could call me an atheistic agnostic.
But I would think Thomas Huxley, who came up and coined the term agnostic, probably would not have approved of Blaise Pascal.
No, but he would have acknowledged that you can be an agnostic and still hold a belief. Even though you don't have a knowledge, you could still claim that belief.
And I like to say, I don't care what you call yourself, whether you're a humanist or a skeptic or a rationalist or an atheist or an agnostic, we all just believe in the same gods.
Yeah. Yeah. Although, I would say that if you define God in a certain way, carefully enough, we could say as atheists, well, I actually know that particular God doesn't exist. I don't necessarily...
Well, the God of the Bible.
Yeah, like the God of the Bible. It'd be like arguing for the existence of a married bachelor. Well, it's mutually contradictory. So that particular God, like an omniscient God who's also omnipotent, cannot actually exist logically. But that doesn't rule out all other possible millions of definitions of a God.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm pretty much all those things you said. I'm an atheist, a humanist, an agnostic, a free thinker, but I just choose to call myself an atheist for fun. It's an important one too. We have another question from Kim Countryman. I've seen a celebrity interview where this person said that they walk away immediately upon finding out that someone is an atheist, and they refuse to speak to them. How do you address people who refuse to talk to you on any level based solely on your non-belief?
Well, pretty hard to address them if they walk away from you. I think that just shows the bigotry of religion, that they've spent too many hours in the pew being preached at and hearing Bible verses like Psalms, 14,
yeah.
That the fool has said in his heart that there's a God, and
there's no God, yeah.
There's no atheist who's ever done anything good. Mm-hmm. And so that's obvious. Somebody has been heavily indoctrinated, and they put their dogma above people, and that's the harm of religion again.
I think there's also a little bit of an admission in refusing to even engage. You know, it's your ideas about the world, your religion can't withstand any type of new input or criticism or questioning or even a conversation. You know, it's almost admitting the weakness of their belief system.
Yeah.
I want to know who that celebrity is.
Yeah, maybe Kim will share a little more information on Facebook, and we can look at that more closely.
In this section of brilliant arguments against religion, we'll reminisce about that time Christopher Hitchens debated a Christian apologist, and the apologist made a point that left Christopher Hitchens stunned. During the debate, Christopher Hitchens pointed out that if God exists, he must be the farthest thing from perfection, because he created and placed us on a planet that will be blasted away by the red giant, our sun, within 5 billion years. Scientists actually believe this is inevitable, and are confident all life on Earth will be wiped out within 500 million years. So how did the apologist respond to that? Well, he claimed that it's the belief within the Christian faith that God will not allow this to happen, that he will intervene in the last minute and save our planet from damnation. Just like Hitchens, I was stunned, because I did not think even Christians would be confident enough to make such a leap. Not even back then, when the Catholic Church was whipping out new doctrines out of their every time they wished. Again, this also reminded me one of the main reasons that I left religion myself. Like most of you, I'm sure, leaving Christianity did not happen just like that. It was a series of things that strengthened my conviction and assured me that I was doing the right thing. It actually started with me stopping my weekly tithe to the multi-million church I attended that never actually did anything in service of the needy within our society. And later on, I was confident enough to stop attending the church altogether every Sunday, and now it's been years, man, of freedom. In fact, actually, today one of my favorite pastimes is respectfully semi-debating preachers and Islamic leaders on why they think their religion is the right one, and everyone else who denies that will go to hell. Emphasis on respectfully, because I also learned way too late that aggressively tearing someone else's religion down doesn't actually do what we think it does. If anything, it does the opposite and only strengthens their hold on said religion. I personally don't know how that works. Maybe psychologists in the comment section can figure that out and let us know. Now, on the contrary, simply poking holes into someone's long-held belief and then letting the arguments you make marinate within their conscience can actually do wonders. Anyway guys, my point was, one of the most pivotal moments during my journey out of religion was reading about William Tyndale. I believe most of you are already familiar with him, and for those that are not, William Tyndale was a gentleman born in England in 1494 at the height of unparalleled religious corruption. You know, back when the church was conveniently finding heretics to burn at the stake every waking moment. I'm sure you've all heard of that moment, man. Religions really do have some of the most effed up histories, man, don't they? Yeah. Anyway, back then, the Roman Catholic Church had also forbade the translation of the Bible from the Latin language to English, and since a majority of the people in England at the time could not speak Latin, it meant that only those in the upper echelon of society were able to read the Bible for themselves. So William Tyndale came along and saw through the utter corruption of the Catholic Church and became convinced that everyone should be able to read the Bible in their own language. And if no one else was willing to make that happen, then he was going to do it himself. And immediately William Tyndale started working on a New Testament translation in 1523, which must mean he was around 29 years old when he undertook this monumental task, the same age that I am today. Yeah. We've really fallen far as a society, man. Wow. Anyway, after the Roman Catholic caught a whiff of what Tyndale was up to, our man had no choice but to run to Germany in 1524 and complete his work while there. He completed his New Testament translations by July 1525 and smuggled the first copies of the translation into England by 1526. When, needless to say, they were immediately made illegal by both the government and the church. But William Tyndale definitely wasn't done, if we've learned anything about him. Immediately after that, Tyndale started working on a translation of the Old Testament. But unfortunately, man, he'd been captured in Antwerp, Belgium before his work was completed. The Catholic Church immediately charged him with the crime of heresy, and for his punishment, Tyndale was dragged out into the cobblestone streets, strangled to death in front of an onlooking crowd, and then his lifeless body was burned at the stake by the church. On the bright side, at least, at the time of William Tyndale's death, more than, I believe, tens of thousands of copies of his New Testament translation had been printed and circulated around Europe. And after that, the rest is history. He's easily one of the main reasons that we have the Bible in so many languages today. Yeah. Every time I revisit William Tyndale's story, I remember that one quote that we all non-believers love. With or without religion, good people will still do good, evil people will still do evil, but for good people to do evil things, that often requires religion. Because you cannot really convince me that among all the onlookers, including the perpetrators of William Tyndale's humiliation and eventual assassination, you cannot really convince me that every single person in that crowd was evil, man. But yet, somehow, they supported what the church did to the man. And, by the way, today, while refreshing my mind on the life and death of William Tyndale, I came across a religious website, the Shepherds.Church, and in a portion of their website they wrote, and while William's death was a sad day in the history of the English-speaking peoples, it also offers tremendous hope, because while Tyndale's God allowed the smoke of his body to rise up and over Europe, the same God was also causing the winds of Reformation fire to blow. This is the convenience I'm always talking about when it comes to religious people just co-opting every single thing good and using it in praise of their God, but sidestepping everything evil allowed by that same God within the exact same context. So, in this situation, the translation of the Bible to many languages was a landmark point in the history of the spread of Christianity. But not only did God not choose to soften the hearts of the church leaders like he did with Pharaoh and compel them to translate the Bible themselves, he also let the man that took it upon himself to accomplish this task get murdered in one of the most humiliating and sick ways I've personally ever heard of. But hey, at least this God caused the winds of Reformation fire to blow across England, man. Yo, it will be funny if it wasn't so sad. And by the way, despite sanctioning more crimes than any authoritarian state against humanity to ever exist, the Catholic Church remains the largest Christian church to this day. And just in case I need to mention it, this isn't unique to the Catholic Church. Oh, it's equally destructive Abrahamic siblings. Organized religions, generally speaking, man, have been impeccable forces of destruction. But still, somehow, thousands of years down the line, we still let them spew whatever nonsense they see fit and claim it as a divine message from their sky daddy. Just like we saw with the gentleman, the apologist that Hitchens debated, the one that believes God will intervene and stop the destruction of the universe. I'm not saying we should do anything to infringe on their freedom of belief for expression, but placing them side by side with real accomplished scientists or rational thinkers is crazy to me, man. As someone else pointed out in the comment section of a previous video that I posted, religions are cults, and if they're not willing to renounce the evil within their fantasy novels, then they should be treated as such, as cults.